What if the exhaustion that has followed you for years is not a failure of your body, but a deliberate signal from something deeper? You slept 9 hours last night and woke up as if you hadn't slept at all. Not groggy, but emptied, as if something drained you from inside while your body lay perfectly still. You've tried everything. Earlier bedtimes, supplements, exercise. You've sat in doctors' offices describing a tiredness they can't find in your bloodwork, can't find in your scans, can't match to any diagnosis they know how to treat, and watched them suggest stress reduction with the polite blankness of someone who has no idea what you're carrying. Has it occurred to you that this fatigue gets worse after certain people, not after physical effort? That you can work for 12 hours on something that matters to you and feel alive, but 10 minutes with the wrong person leaves you unable to think? That the exhaustion lifts when you're alone, really alone, and returns the moment you step back into the life you've built? This tiredness doesn't live in your muscles. It lives somewhere deeper, in a place that no amount of rest can reach, because rest isn't what it's asking for. What if your psyche is refusing to fuel a life you've outgrown, and this refusal feels exactly like dying, because in a very real psychological sense, something inside you is. You've felt this since before you had language for it. At 8 or 9 years old, you were already tired in ways that didn't match your age. Other children ran toward the world. You observed it, registering undercurrents no one acknowledged, processing emotional information that wasn't yours to carry. By 12, you had become the one who noticed when something was wrong before anyone said a word, the silent interpreter of every room you entered. By 16, the pattern was operational. You could sustain long hours of intellectual or creative absorption that never drained you, but 30 minutes of social performance left you needing hours of recovery that no one around you required. You learned to call it introversion. You learned to schedule solitude the way other people schedule meals. By 25, you had built an entire architecture of coping around this fundamental mismatch between the energy the world demanded and the energy you could generate for the life you were actually living. Here's what no one told you about that architecture. It worked. It worked well enough to keep you functional, productive, even successful by external measures, but it worked the way a dam works, by holding something back. And what was being held back was not weakness. It was the full force of a psychic life that had nowhere to go, because the channels your conscious mind had built were too narrow to carry it. Carl Jung spent decades studying what happens when psychic energy, what he called libido, referring simply to the total life force that animates everything you do, create, and desire, stops flowing forward. He observed that when the conscious attitude can no longer adapt to what the deeper personality requires, the energy doesn't disappear. It withdraws. It pulls back from the surface of your life like a tide retreating from the shore. And what's left on the surface, the you that shows up to work, maintains relationships, answers messages, that version operates on reserve power, functional but hollow, present but fading. You've been calling this exhaustion. Jung called it something far more precise: regression of libido, the backward movement of psychic energy into the unconscious, not as collapse but as preparation. Now here is where everything you've been told about this experience falls apart. The wellness industry has built an empire on your tiredness. They've told you the exhaustion is burnout, that you've given too much and need to replenish. They've told you it's your boundaries, that if you just learned to say no more effectively, the energy would return. They've sold you retreats, supplements, morning routines, dopamine protocols, nervous system resets, and some of that helped. Briefly, enough to keep you buying. But the exhaustion always returned, didn't it? Because none of those interventions addressed what's actually happening. They treated your fatigue as a deficit, as though you were a battery running low that simply needed recharging. But you are not a battery running low. You are a psyche in the process of dismantling a life that no longer fits. And that dismantling requires enormous energy. Energy that your unconscious has been quietly redirecting away from the surface of your life and pouring into a process you can't yet see. This is the part that most people cannot accept. Your exhaustion is not the problem. Your exhaustion is the solution. The only language your deeper psyche has to tell you that the life your ego built is too small for what you're becoming. The tiredness isn't stealing your energy. Something inside you is using that energy for a construction project that hasn't broken the surface yet. Jung observed this pattern with striking consistency. Before every major psychological transformation, there is a period of seemingly purposeless depletion. He compared it to what ancient mythologies called the night sea journey, the sun being swallowed by the ocean at dusk, traveling through darkness in the belly of the deep, only to emerge transformed at dawn. To anyone watching from the shore, the sun has died. But beneath the water, something essential is being renewed. You are in the belly of that ocean right now, and the well-meaning people telling you to just rest more, set better boundaries, find a new hobby. They're standing on the shore, shouting instructions to someone who is underwater. There is usually a moment when the exhaustion shifts from chronic background noise to something you can no longer manage. A specific point where the dam doesn't just hold, it cracks. For some, it arrives alongside illness. The body has its own reality, its own causes, and none of what I'm describing replaces medical understanding. But illness also creates a forced stillness, and in that stillness, something psychological often begins to surface. Truths you've been outrunning for years suddenly have nowhere to hide when you can't get out of bed. Memories, emotions, questions you've been drowning out with productivity and purpose. For others, it arrives as a quiet collapse of meaning. You wake up one morning, and the career that defined you feels like a costume. The relationship that sustained you feels like a contract you signed before you understood the terms. The identity you've presented to the world, competent, reliable, understanding, suddenly feels like a performance you can no longer afford to fund. Not because it was false, but because it was incomplete. Jung understood that this collapse is not random. It is the ego's encounter with what he called the self, the deeper, more complete personality that has been waiting beneath your constructed identity. The self does not negotiate. It does not send gentle invitations. When the gap between who you are performing and who you actually are becomes too wide, the self withdraws its energy from the performance, completely, and the result is exactly what you've been experiencing. A tiredness that nothing fixes, because it is not a problem to be fixed. It is a summons. This is the moment Jung called the beginning of individuation, not as a philosophical concept, but as a psychological crisis that arrives when you can no longer sustain the distance between your life and your nature. The old personality must be partially dismantled before the new one can emerge. And dismantling requires going dark, going silent, going under. What comes next is not a recovery. It is a restructuring. And based on Jung's extensive observations, this restructuring moves through distinct phases that will look from the outside like you are getting worse before you get better. The first phase is what I call the great refusal. Your energy stops being available for anything that doesn't align with what your deeper self requires. This is not a decision you make consciously. It happens to you. The projects you use to power through become impossible. The social obligations you used to fulfill with effort now feel physically intolerable. You begin canceling things, withdrawing from people, dropping commitments that once defined you. The people around you will notice. They'll call it depression. They'll call it laziness. They'll say you've changed, and they'll mean it as an accusation because your previous availability was something they depended on. The version of you that could always show up, always perform, always carry more than your share. That version was convenient for everyone around you. Its disappearance feels like betrayal to those who never realized it was costing you everything. Here is what you need to understand about this phase. The refusal is not pathology. It is your psyche performing triage. It is redirecting every available unit of energy toward the interior work that must happen. Productivity isn't the goal. Presence isn't the goal. Survival of the emerging self is the goal. And your unconscious will sacrifice every external structure to protect that emergence, whether your ego agrees or not. The second phase is the descent itself. Jung called it the Nekyia, borrowed from the ancient Greek rite of descending into the underworld to consult the dead. Not literally, of course. But the metaphor is precise, because what you encounter during this phase are the dead parts of yourself, the unlived emotions, the unacknowledged truths, the abandoned capacities, the parts of your nature you killed to maintain acceptance. This is the phase where the 3 a.m. thoughts intensify, where dreams become vivid, disturbing, impossible to ignore, where grief surfaces for losses you thought you'd processed years ago, where anger appears, real anger, not the diluted version you've been allowing yourself, and it terrifies you because you've spent your entire life believing that your value was measured by your capacity to absorb rather than to refuse. Most people try to escape this phase, and here is the part that requires honesty, because without it, everything I've said becomes just another form of flattery. Part of you doesn't want to escape. Part of you has used the exhaustion as a shelter, being the tired one, the depleted one, the one who can't quite show up fully. That identity protected you from the terrifying possibility of actually living at full capacity. If you never had enough energy, you never had to risk finding out what would happen if you did. The descent forces you to confront that too, not just the unlived pain, but the unlived power, and your complicity in keeping it unlived. The wellness industry exists largely to help you avoid that confrontation, to return you to functionality as quickly as possible, as if functionality were the point. But Jung was adamant. The descent is not the disease, it is the cure. Every piece of yourself you encounter in that darkness is a piece of energy that was trapped, frozen, locked in the unconscious, because your conscious life had no place for it. Reclaiming it hurts. It is supposed to hurt. But each reclaimed fragment returns energy to the system, real energy. Not the borrowed, caffeinated, performance-driven energy you've been surviving on. The energy of a psyche that is finally becoming whole. The third phase is the return, but not to who you were. You don't go back. The exhaustion begins to lift, but what emerges on the other side is not the person who went under. It is someone your former self would barely recognize. You become selectively alive. Where before you were depleted by everything, now you are animated by specific things, and immovable toward everything else. Your energy is no longer a general resource available to anyone who asks. It becomes a directed force. You don't have more energy, you have accurate energy. Energy that flows only toward what is genuinely yours. This is what Jung called the differentiated personality. Not someone who has learned better boundaries. That's management. But someone whose psychic structure has been reorganized so that boundaries are no longer necessary in the old way, because the false self that had no boundaries has dissolved. What remains doesn't need protecting. It is protection. When this restructuring completes, the effects ripple outward in ways you won't fully control. The people who loved the exhausted version of you, the one who was always available, always accommodating, always willing to carry what they couldn't, those people will experience your transformation as a loss. Some will grieve it honestly and meet you where you actually are. These relationships deepen into something you didn't know was possible. Connection without depletion, presence without performance. Others will resist. They'll tell you you've become distant, selfish, cold. They'll construct a narrative in which your illness or withdrawal was the problem, and your failure to return to the previous shape is the betrayal. Let them. Their reaction is not about you. It is a diagnostic. It reveals exactly what they were attached to, which was never you. It was your function. The difference between who stays and who leaves will teach you more about your relationships than years of careful analysis ever could. And you will feel the loss, not because you were wrong to change, but because you loved some of those people genuinely. You can grieve them without going back. That capacity to feel loss without reversing your transformation is one of the hallmarks of what Jung called the integrated personality. So let me tell you plainly what you've become. You are not someone who recovered from exhaustion. You are someone who was taken apart by their own psyche and reassembled with nothing false left in the structure. The tiredness that haunted you for years was not a flaw in your system. It was your system refusing to power a life built on adaptation rather than truth. Every year you spent dragging yourself through days that didn't fit. Every night you lay awake wondering why existence felt so heavy when nothing was technically wrong. That was the night sea journey. You were in the ocean. You were being remade. And what you carry now is not the fragile energy of someone managing their limits. It is the focused, undeniable force of someone whose inner and outer life have finally converged. You don't need to protect your energy anymore. You've stopped wasting it. You don't need to explain your withdrawal to anyone. The people who understand didn't need an explanation, and the people who demanded one weren't listening. Your sensitivity didn't weaken you. It registered with perfect accuracy that something was wrong, not with you, but with the shape of the life you were living. And your exhaustion was the only honest response your psyche could produce until you were ready to hear what it was actually saying. This life is too small. You must go under. You must let the old form die. And what comes after will be worth every year you spent in the dark. But here is what I want you to sit with before you go. The night sea journey doesn't produce someone who arrives at a destination. It produces someone who no longer needs one. The urgency that used to drive you, to prove, to achieve, to be seen as enough, that urgency was the exhaustion talking. It was the ego burning through energy it didn't have, trying to outrun a transformation it couldn't prevent. What replaces that urgency is something quieter, a steadiness that doesn't come from discipline or willpower, but from alignment. The simple, almost physical sensation of living inside a life that fits, not a perfect life, Not an easy one, but one where the energy you generate actually goes where it's meant to go, instead of leaking through cracks in a structure that was built for someone you no longer are. Jung wrote that the goal of individuation is not happiness, it is wholeness, and wholeness, when you actually arrive at it, feels less like triumph and more like rest, real rest, the kind that sleep could never give you because it wasn't your body that was tired. It was your soul waiting for you to stop building the wrong house and finally come home. You're not lazy, you're not broken, you're not depressed in the way they mean it when they say the word. You are undergoing the oldest transformation the human psyche knows, the death that precedes becoming. And the exhaustion is proof, not that you're failing, but that the process is already underway. Be still, the sun is coming back. Now I want to ask you something specific. Think back, not to when the exhaustion started, because it probably started so early you can't pinpoint it. Think instead to the moment you realized that rest would never fix it. The moment you understood, maybe without words, that this tiredness was not about sleep or stress or boundaries, that it was something else entirely, something that lived deeper than any solution you'd been offered could reach. When was that moment? What were you doing? What had just happened in your life? Tell me in the comments, not because sharing heals, that's a comfortable cliche, but because naming the moment is the first act of consciousness. And consciousness, as Jung understood it, is the only thing that has ever transformed anything. If this reached something in you that other content doesn't reach, subscribe. This channel exists for the ones who need depth, not comfort. And if you want to support this work directly, the join button is right below this video. Thanks for watching. See you soon in the next video, Deep Mind.